The body floats face down in the dark Atlantic water, its limbs splayed like a broken marionette. Around it, dozens more drift in the pre-dawn darkness, some still twitching, most eerily still. On a makeshift wooden raft barely 20 feet wide, 147 human beings have been reduced to something primal, something unrecognizable. The screaming has finally stopped. The silence that follows is somehow worse. A man, his lips cracked and bleeding from saltwater exposure, stares at his own hands that just hours ago committed an act he never imagined himself capable of. Above, the stars wheel across the African sky, indifferent to the nightmare unfolding below. This is the third night. Only 13 days remain before rescue. Most of those currently breathing won't see the sunrise. This is the true story of the Raft of the Medusa, a maritime disaster so horrifying, so utterly devastating in its descent into madness that it would shake the foundations of a nation, topple a government, and force humanity to confront the terrifying fragility of civilization itself. What happened on that raft in July of 1816 wasn't just a tragedy. It was a systematic unraveling of everything we believe separates us from the abyss. Welcome to the deadliest sea journey in history. A voyage doomed before it began. July 17, 1816. The French naval frigate Medusa sits in the harbor of Rochefort, France, preparing for a journey that will transform her from a symbol of French maritime pride into an eternal monument to human suffering. At 150 feet long and displacing over 1,000 tons, the Medusa represents the restored might of post-Napoleonic France, a nation desperate to reclaim its colonial glory after years of war and revolution. She's bound for Senegal, tasked with reclaiming the port of St. Louis from British control and establishing French authority over West African territories. But there's a problem. A catastrophic, fatal problem that everyone can see, but no one dares to acknowledge. The man chosen to command this critical expedition has barely set foot on a ship in over 20 years. Hugh de Roy de Chameret, a 55-year-old aristocrat, earned his captaincy not through competence or experience, but through loyalty to the restored Bourbon monarchy. During Napoleon's reign, de Chameret had been in exile. While other naval officers gained experience battling the British Navy, commanding complex operations, navigating treacherous waters, de Chameret was attending social functions and waiting for the political winds to shift in his favor. Now, those winds have shifted. King Louis XVIII has returned to power, and with him, the old aristocracy. In this new France, or rather this restored old France, political reliability matters more than nautical expertise. De Chameret gets the command because he remained loyal to the crown, not because he can read a chart or navigate by the stars. The sailors know this. They whisper about it in the dark corners of the ship, their voices carrying an edge of fatalistic dread. Their captain hasn't commanded a vessel in over 24 years. He's never commanded anything larger than a small coastal vessel. The Medusa is a 40-gun frigate, one of the most complex machines of the age, requiring precise coordination between hundreds of crew members and an intimate understanding of sailing dynamics that takes decades to master. On board the Medusa are approximately 400 people. Not just sailors, but an entire colonial expedition. There are soldiers destined for the garrison at St. Louis, colonial administrators and their families, engineers, scientists, and even a few wealthy passengers seeking fortune in Africa. Among them are notable figures whose testimonies will later prove crucial. Alexander Corriard, a 28-year-old geographical engineer, and Jean-Baptiste Henri Savigny, a 29-year-old surgeon. Both men are educated, articulate, and completely unprepared for what's about to happen to them. The Medusa doesn't travel alone. She's part of a small convoy of 4 ships. The frigate Medusa herself, the Loire carrying soldiers and supplies, the Argus, a smaller brig, and the corvette Echo. This convoy arrangement should provide safety. If one ship encounters trouble, others can assist. It's a sensible precaution for a dangerous journey that will take them down the coast of Africa, past the treacherous shoals off modern-day Mauritania, through waters where European ships have been running aground for centuries. The route they're taking is well known to experienced sailors. The western coast of Africa, particularly the stretch near the Argan Bank off modern-day Mauritania, is a nautical nightmare. The Argan Bank is a vast underwater sandbar that extends miles out to sea, invisible until your ship is already stuck on it. The depth can go from 100 feet to 15 feet in the space of a few hundred yards. The currents are treacherous, the charts are notoriously unreliable, and the entire area is known as a ship's graveyard. Experienced captains know to give the Argan Bank a wide berth. They sail far out to sea, well west of the danger zone, even if it means adding days to the journey. The French Navy has explicit instructions about this route, passed down through generations of sailors who learned the hard way about respecting the African coast. De Chaumareix has these instructions. He's been briefed on the dangers. But he also has something else: an unshakable confidence in his own judgment and an aristocratic disdain for the wisdom of common sailors. As the convoy departs Rochefort, the officers of the other ships exchange worried glances. They've met de Chaumareix. They've heard him dismiss concerns about the route. They've watched him ignore advice from his own experienced subordinates. But naval protocol is clear. The Medusa is the flagship, and de Chaumareix is in command. They can only follow and hope that somehow, against all evidence, things will work out. The journey begins normally enough. The convoy makes good progress down the coast of France, past Spain, approaching the Canary Islands. The weather is favorable, the seas are calm, and for a brief moment it seems like perhaps the warriors were wrong. Perhaps de Chaumareix, despite his long absence from sea duty, retained enough knowledge to see them through. But then the decisions start coming, one after another, each more baffling than the last. By early July, the convoy has reached the most critical phase of the journey. They're approaching the Cape Verde Islands, about to enter the danger zone off the Mauritanian coast. This is the moment when experienced captains become hyper-vigilant, when every depth sounding matters, when the advice of veteran sailors can mean the difference between a safe passage and disaster. Instead, something inexplicable happens. Captain de Chaumareix begins making decisions that range from questionable to catastrophic. First, he starts ignoring his own navigation officers. The Medusa has competent men on board. The ship's first lieutenant, Espiau, is an experienced sailor who knows these waters. But de Chaumareix has found a new advisor, a passenger named Richefort, a former merchant captain who claims to know a faster route. Richefort hasn't sailed these waters in years, his charts are outdated, and his confidence far exceeds his competence. But he flatters de Chaumareix, speaks to him as an equal rather than questioning his decisions, and in the toxic hierarchy of the Bourbon Restoration, that's worth more than expertise. The proper route, the safe route, calls for sailing far to the west of the African coast, staying at least 50 to 60 leagues offshore to avoid the Argan Bank. This adds perhaps 2 or 3 days to the journey, but it virtually eliminates the risk of running aground. Every French naval instruction manual emphasizes this point. The path is clear, the science is settled, the collective wisdom of generations of sailors points in one direction. De Chaumareix decides to cut the corner. He orders a course that will take them much closer to shore. Not 50 leagues, not 40, not even 30. He plans to sail within sight of the African coast, shaving days off the journey, and in his mind, proving his nautical brilliance to the passengers and crew. His officers object. They object politely at first, then with increasing urgency as the danger becomes obvious. Lieutenant Espiau points to the charts, shows the clearly marked hazards, recounts the history of ships lost on the Argan Bank. He's dismissed. Other officers raise concerns. They're told to follow orders. The surgeon Savigny, who has befriended several of the navigation officers, later recalls the palpable dread that settled over the ship's command structure. Men who knew they were sailing towards disaster, but were powerless to stop it. The other ships in the convoy notice. The captains of the Loire, Argus, and Echo watch in disbelief as the Medusa begins steering an inexplicably dangerous course. They signal to Deschamps, trying to get him to adjust his heading. He ignores them. Frustrated and afraid, the other captains make the only decision they can. They refuse to follow the Medusa into obvious danger. One by one, the other ships peel away from the convoy, choosing safer routes even though it means disobeying the flagship. The Medusa continues alone toward the coast of Africa, her captain increasingly isolated from reality, her crew watching the horizon with mounting terror. July 2nd, 1816, dawns clear and calm. The Medusa is now dangerously close to the African coast. The officers have been taking depth soundings constantly, dropping weighted lines over the side to measure how much water lies beneath the keel. The readings are getting shallower. 60 feet, 50 feet, 40 feet. The Medusa draws about 15 feet of water, meaning they need to maintain at least 20 feet of depth for safety. Any less, and they risk grounding. The soundings continue to drop. 35 feet, 30 feet. The officers are now openly alarmed. They report to Deschamps. He waves them off. He's sure of his position, sure of his course, sure that these worrying sailors simply don't understand navigation the way he does. 28 feet, 25 feet, 22 feet. At 3 p.m. on July 2nd, sailing under full canvas with a fresh wind, the Medusa hits the Argon bank with a sickening crunch that can be heard throughout the ship. The impact isn't dramatic like in movies. There's no explosion of splintered wood, no immediate listing to one side. Instead, the ship simply stops. The forward momentum ceases instantly, as if some giant hand reached up from the depths and grabbed the hull. The masts shudder, sailors are thrown to the deck, and throughout the ship, 400 people suddenly understand that their worst fears have been realized. They're stuck. A 1,000-ton warship, miles from shore, immobilized on the sandbar in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The initial reaction is shock, followed quickly by an almost comical attempt to pretend everything is fine. Deschamps orders the crew to lighten the ship. If they can reduce the draft, perhaps they can float free with the next tide. It's not an unreasonable plan. Ships have grounded before and gotten off with careful weight management and favorable tides. They start throwing things overboard. Not essential things, not yet. Furniture, some supplies, excess cargo. The crew works through the afternoon and into the evening. The tide comes in. They wait. The tide goes out. The Medusa doesn't budge. She's stuck fast, held by thousands of tons of sand that have molded themselves around her hull like concrete. The next day, they try more aggressive measures. They throw over 14 cannons, each weighing over a ton. These are the ship's primary armament, irreplaceable weapons representing months of skilled metalwork. They watch them sink into the murky water off the African coast. Still, the ship doesn't move. They try kedging, setting an anchor far from the ship and using the capstan to winch the Medusa toward it, literally pulling her off the sandbar. The technique requires enormous effort, with dozens of men straining at the capstan bars, walking in endless circles as the mechanism clicks and groans. The anchor line goes taut. The ship groans. For a moment, it seems like it might work. Then the anchor line snaps, and any hope of kedging their way free vanishes. Days pass. 3 days, then 4, then 5. The Medusa sits motionless on the Argon bank while her crew and passengers descend into panic. The initial shock has given way to a horrible realization. They're not getting off. The sandbar has them, and it's not letting go. The situation is actually worse than anyone realizes. The grounding has damaged the hull. Water is seeping in, not catastrophically, but steadily. The pumps are running constantly, barely keeping pace with the leak. If they can't get the ship off soon, she's going to sink right where she sits. And they're alone. The other ships in the convoy are gone, pursuing their own courses to Senegal. No one knows exactly where the Medusa is. There will be no immediate rescue. On July 4th, reality finally penetrates de Chamaray's aristocratic certainty. He calls a council of officers. The question is simple. How do we get 400 people off this dying ship? The Medusa carries 6 lifeboats, 6 small vessels designed to ferry people and supplies between ship and shore or to serve as emergency escape craft. Together, they can carry perhaps 250 people if packed uncomfortably tight. That's a problem when you have 400 people who need to evacuate. The math is simple and brutal. The lifeboats aren't enough. Someone, and historical accounts differ on exactly who first proposed the idea, suggests building a raft. A large raft that can carry the overflow of people who won't fit in the lifeboats. It's not a crazy idea, in theory. Rafts have been used for maritime evacuations before. They're stable, can carry heavy loads, and if properly constructed, can be towed to shore by the lifeboats. The key phrase being, if properly constructed. What happens next is a masterclass in how panic, incompetence, and rigid social hierarchy can transform a challenging situation into an absolute catastrophe. The construction of the raft begins on July 5th, 1816. The crew starts lashing together spare timbers, masts, yards, any long piece of wood they can find. There's no real plan, no engineering oversight, just desperate men throwing together whatever they can. The engineer Corriard, one of the few people on board with actual structural knowledge, tries to offer suggestions. Sometimes he's listened to, often he's ignored. The raft takes shape over the course of several hours. When it's finished, if finished is the right word for something so hastily assembled, it measures approximately 65 feet long by 23 feet wide. The construction is shockingly crude. Massive timbers lashed together with rope, some sections bound with iron hoops salvaged from wine barrels. There's no real deck, just the timbers themselves with gaps between them. There are no sides, no railings, no shelter of any kind. It's essentially a giant wooden pallet. But here's the truly horrifying part. The raft has no means of propulsion. No mast, no sails, no oars. The plan, insofar as there is a plan, is for the lifeboats to tow it. The raft is meant to be a passive cargo platform, pulled behind the boats like a barge as they make their way to the African coast, which is visible perhaps 50 miles away. Let's pause here and consider what this means. The men who designed this evacuation plan expected that 6 small boats, themselves crammed with passengers and supplies, would be able to tow a 65 by 23-foot raft loaded with people across 50 miles of open ocean. Anyone with even basic knowledge of sailing, of wind resistance, water drag, and the physical limits of human endurance would recognize this as nearly impossible. But recognition requires that someone in authority be willing to listen to people with actual expertise. De Chaumet isn't that person. Neither are most of the other officers who seem more concerned with their own survival than with the success of the overall evacuation plan. As July 5th turns to July 6th, a second problem emerges. Who goes where? Who gets a spot in the precious lifeboats, and who gets consigned to the raft? In a functional maritime emergency, this decision would be governed by established protocol, women and children first, then officers needed to navigate the boats, then the rest distributed by lottery or some other fair system. But this isn't a functional maritime emergency. This is the Bourbon Restoration in microcosm, a rigid social hierarchy asserting itself even as death looms. The decisions are made not based on need or fairness, but social class. The colonial governor, Julien Désiré Schmaltz, claims an entire boat for himself, his wife, and their entourage. Officers and wealthy passengers secure their spots. The captain and his favorites ensure their safety. And then, when the boats are allocated, what remains, the raft, is designated for the least important people. The soldiers, the sailors, the low-ranking crew, the poor. Alexandre Corriard, the engineer, is assigned to the raft despite his value in education, perhaps because he had angered the captain by questioning the ship's course. The surgeon Savini is assigned there too, because a doctor might be useful for the people nobody cares about. Approximately 147 people are designated for the raft. 147 people assigned to a platform with no propulsion, no shelter, and no real plan for survival beyond "the boats will tow us to shore." On the morning of July 5th, the evacuation begins, and immediately everything that can go wrong does go wrong. The lifeboats launch first. There's confusion about the order, arguments about who goes when, small acts of cowardice and selfishness that will haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Some passengers abandon belongings that could have been useful, food, water, tools, in their panic to reach the boats. Then comes the loading of the raft. Getting 147 people onto a flat platform with no sides in choppy seas turns out to be nearly impossible. People have to jump from the Medusa's deck onto the raft, timing their leaps between waves. Some miss and fall into the water. Others land poorly, twisting ankles, cracking ribs against the unforgiving timbers. When everyone is finally aboard the raft, the full horror of the situation becomes apparent. 147 people standing on a platform roughly the size of a tennis court. No space to sit down properly. No shelter from the sun or spray. And alarmingly, the raft sits much deeper in the water than anyone expected. The weight of all those people has pushed it down until seawater sloshes across the timbers, rising to knee height in some places. This is the moment when the plan should have been reconsidered. This is when a competent commander would have looked at the overloaded raft, realized the situation was untenable, and revised the evacuation strategy. Perhaps made multiple trips, perhaps redistributed passengers more evenly. Something. Instead, Deschamps gives the order to cast off. The tow lines are attached, ropes running from the 6 lifeboats to the front of the raft. The boats begin to pull. For the first few hundred yards, as they move away from the Medusa, the system seems to work. The raft follows behind the boats, the people on it clutching each other for balance, cold seawater soaking them to the bone. Then the wind picks up. The sea state changes. The boats struggle against the drag of the raft. The people in the boats, the officers, the aristocrats, the ones who secured their own safety, begin to realize that towing this burden to shore is going to be much harder than they thought. On the raft, the 147 people watch the lifeboats ahead of them, watch the Medusa receding behind them, and begin to understand that their fate is entirely in the hands of people who have already demonstrated their willingness to prioritize self-preservation over collective survival. It's the afternoon of July 5th, 1816. They've been underway for less than an hour. The nightmare is about to begin in earnest. For the first hour after leaving the Medusa, the convoy of lifeboats and the raft moves slowly but steadily away from the wreck. The African coast is visible on the horizon, a yellow-brown line that promises salvation if they can just reach it. The people on the raft, despite their discomfort, allow themselves a fragile hope. Yes, they're cold. Yes, they're crowded. Yes, seawater keeps washing over the platform, soaking them repeatedly. But they're moving. The boats are pulling them. In perhaps 2 days, maybe 3, they'll reach shore. Then the tow ropes go slack. It happens boat by boat, starting with the vessels farthest from the raft. Later, survivors will dispute the exact sequence and timing, but the basic facts are undeniable. Sometime in the mid-afternoon of July 5th, 1816, the 6 lifeboats abandoned the raft. The boat carrying Governor Schmaltz is the first to go. The crew claims the tow line broke naturally, that the strain was too much, the rope too weak, but survivors on the raft swear they saw someone lean over the side with a knife. Either way, the result is the same. Schmaltz's boat breaks free and immediately begins pulling away, heading for shore at a pace the raft could never match. One by one, the other boats follow. The captain's barge, the boat carrying Deschamps himself, cuts its line next. Then the others, each offering its own excuse or simply leaving without explanation. Some boats at least have the decency to pretend the separation was accidental. Others don't even bother with the performance. On the raft, the realization spreads like wildfire. The boats aren't slowing down. They're not attempting to reconnect the tow lines. They're running away at full speed, sails raised to catch every bit of available wind. The raft, with its 147 souls, has been deliberately abandoned in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Imagine this moment. You're standing on a makeshift platform, water sloshing around your knees, watching the only hope of rescue sailing away toward the horizon. You're surrounded by 146 other people experiencing the same horrified realization. The shock is so complete that for several minutes, no one even speaks. They just watch the boats shrink to dots, then to nothing. When the screaming starts, it doesn't stop for a long time. The people on the raft are not fools. They understand instantly what this abandonment means. The raft has no propulsion, no sails, no oars, nothing. It's at the mercy of wind and current. The African coast, which looked reachable with the boat's help, is now impossibly far away. Even if they could somehow paddle with their hands, even if the currents were favorable, reaching shore would take days or weeks. They don't have days or weeks. They have 25 pounds of ship's biscuit. That's approximately 11 kilograms. They have 2 barrels of water, each containing about 60 liters, for 147 people, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, under the African sun. Do the math? That's less than a liter of water per person. The ship's biscuit, if distributed evenly, works out to roughly 75 grams per person, about the size of a small dinner roll. This is not survival supplies. This is a death sentence with a timer. But the initial response isn't despair, it's disbelief mixed with rage. The soldiers on the raft are armed. They have muskets, bayonets, sabers. Their first impulse is to fire after the departing boats, as if bullets could bring them back. Several shots are fired, more in frustration than with any real hope of hitting targets that are already beyond effective range. It's a gesture of pure fury, a middle finger to the aristocrats and officers who have condemned them to death. The engineer Corriard tries to establish some kind of order. He's one of the few people on the raft with education and authority that the others might respect. The surgeon Savigny helps. Together, they attempt to take stock of the situation, to organize the 147 people into something resembling a structured group rather than a panicking mob. They conduct a quick inventory. 147 people, 25 pounds of ship's biscuit, already partially soaked in seawater, 2 barrels of water, 6 days' supply if carefully rationed, a bag of coins, useless, several weapons, muskets, sabers, bayonets, the clothes on their backs, approximately 65 feet of wooden platform with gaps between the timbers, no navigation tools, no fishing equipment, no shelter, no propulsion. Corriard and Savigny try to explain to the group that survival requires discipline. They need to ration the supply strictly. They need to work together. They need to stay calm and conserve energy. Some people listen. Many are too shocked or angry to hear. As the sun sets on July 5th, the first full night on the raft begins, and with darkness comes the cold. The Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Africa isn't uniformly warm. At night, the temperature drops significantly, especially when you're soaking wet. The people on the raft are already drenched from the waves that constantly wash over the platform. Now, with no sun to provide warmth, they begin to shiver uncontrollably. Hypothermia becomes a real threat, even in what should be tropical waters. People try to huddle together for warmth, but the raft is so crowded that there's barely room to move. You can't lie down. The water is too deep across the timbers. You can't sit comfortably. There's not enough space, and the platform is too irregular. The only option is to stand, or to crouch awkwardly, or to lean against other people and hope they don't collapse. The night brings another horror, the realization that the raft wasn't built to support this much weight for this long. The lashings that hold the timbers together begin to work loose. The wood creaks and groans. Gaps between timbers start to widen. People's legs slip through the gaps, requiring others to pull them back up. The structural integrity of the raft, already questionable, is deteriorating with each passing hour. Several people fall through the gaps between timbers during that first night. Most are pulled back up, bruised and terrified. At least 2 are not. They slip through, disappear into the dark water, and are never seen again. Their deaths are almost casual. One moment they're there, the next they're gone, swallowed by the ocean as the raft drifts onward. By dawn on July 6th, the group has diminished to 145 people, and the day brings a sight that crushes what little hope remained. On the horizon, they spot sails, multiple ships moving in formation. It's the convoy, the Loire, the Argus, the Echo, the boats from the Medusa, the rescue they were promised, the boats that were supposed to tow them to shore. The people on the raft go insane with hope. They scream, wave, try to make themselves visible. Surely the ships will see them. Surely this nightmare is ending. The ships sail past, perhaps 2 or 3 miles away, close enough to see clearly, too far to make out individual people on a low-lying raft. The convoy continues towards Senegal, leaving the raft bobbing in their wake. This moment, watching salvation sail away, breaks something in many of the survivors. The polite fiction that they might somehow be rescued, that this was all a terrible mistake that would soon be corrected, evaporates. They are alone. They are forgotten. The people who were supposed to help them have moved on with their lives, probably already composing the reports that will explain how the raft was tragically lost. As day 2 dawns, something shifts in the group's psychology. The veneer of civilization, already thin, begins to crack. Small arguments erupt over positioning on the raft, who gets to stand where, who's taking up too much space. The discussions about rationing food and water become heated. Some people are caught stealing extra portions of the ship's biscuit, which has already started to turn to paste from the constant seawater exposure. And then comes the first real violence. To understand the unique horror of the raft of the Medusa, we need to grasp the scale of maritime disasters in this era and why this one stands apart. Between 1790 and 1820, the Royal Navy alone recorded over 350 major shipwrecks, claiming approximately 12,000 lives, and these are just the documented British losses. French, Spanish, Dutch, and Portuguese vessels added thousands more to the toll. Maritime travel in the age of sail was inherently dangerous. An 1815 study by the British Admiralty calculated that roughly 2.5% of all naval vessels were lost each year to weather, navigation errors, or combat. But even in this context of routine maritime catastrophe, the Medusa disaster was exceptional. The survival rate on the raft, fewer than 10% lasting until rescue, was actually lower than survival rates from most documented shipwrecks, including vessels that sank rapidly in storms. What made the Medusa different wasn't the shipwreck itself, but what happened afterward. The systematic breakdown of human civilization compressed into 13 days on a wooden platform. Maritime historians like Dr. Sarah Palmer of Greenwich University have noted that while the 18th and 19th centuries produced hundreds of maritime stories, only the Medusa provoked immediate governmental investigation, artistic response, and public outrage on an international scale. The painting by Jericho that immortalized the disaster drew 50,000 visitors in its first year of exhibition, a massive number for the era, suggesting the story struck a nerve deeper than typical maritime tragedy. The second night on the raft, July 6th into July 7th, is when everything truly falls apart. The first 24 hours were marked by shock, fear, and discomfort. The second night introduces organized violence. It begins, like many descents into chaos, with alcohol. Among the supplies hauled onto the raft were several casks of wine. Why wine was prioritized over additional water or food is a question that perfectly captures the dysfunction of the evacuation, but there it is. Perhaps 60 liters of red wine, intended to make the journey more bearable. By the evening of the second day, people start drinking. Not sipping, drinking. Deep, desperate gulps of wine to numb the cold, the fear, the growing certainty of death. The wine doesn't make things better, it makes them catastrophically worse. Alcohol on an empty stomach combined with dehydration, exhaustion, and psychological trauma is a recipe for madness. By midnight, drunk men are stumbling around the crowded raft, bumping into others, starting arguments that escalate instantly to physical confrontation. The soldiers, trained for violence and armed with military weapons, become particularly dangerous when intoxicated. The exact trigger for what happens next is disputed in survivor accounts. Some say it started with an accident, a drunk man falling into another, pushing him off the raft into the water. Others claim it began as a conspiracy, a planned mutiny by soldiers who decided to take control of the dwindling supplies. What's certain is that around midnight, organized violence erupts. A group of soldiers, perhaps 20 or 30 men, decide that the raft can't support everyone. Their logic, twisted by alcohol and desperation, follows a certain brutal mathematics. If there's not enough food and water for 145 people, then the solution is to reduce the number of people. They arm themselves with sabers, bayonets, and whatever implements they can grab, and they begin attacking their fellow survivors. The violence is chaotic and horrifying. Men fight hand to hand in knee-deep water on a platform that rocks and heaves with every wave. The darkness is absolute. No moon, no stars visible through the cloud cover. People die not knowing who killed them or why. Some are stabbed. Others are simply shoved off the raft into the ocean, their screams cutting off abruptly as they sink beneath the waves. The engineer Corriard and surgeon Savigny try to stop it. They organize a defense, rallying the officers and more disciplined soldiers to protect the non-combatants. A line of men forms in the center of the raft, armed with whatever they can grab and fighting to hold back the attackers. The battle, if it can be called that, lasts for hours. It's not a clean fight with clear sides and objectives. It's a desperate, confused melee where nobody is entirely sure who's fighting whom or why. At various points, the violence stops, only to flare up again when someone makes an accusation or decides to settle a grudge. By dawn on July 7th, the violence has subsided through sheer exhaustion. The survivors take stock. They count approximately 67 people left on the raft. In a single night, they've lost more than half their number, 78 people dead. Some died in the fighting, others were thrown overboard. A few simply disappeared, whether murdered, falling through the deteriorating planks, or choosing to slip away into the water rather than face another day. The raft itself is in terrible condition. The night's violence has further damaged the already fragile structure. Blood is everywhere, mixing with seawater and turning the platform into a slippery, treacherous surface. The bodies of the dead who weren't thrown overboard lie scattered among the living. The sun rises on the third day. The survivors look at each other and see strangers. These are no longer the people who boarded the raft 2 days ago. Something fundamental has changed. They've crossed a line, and everyone knows there's no crossing back. The day brings new torments. The African sun beats down mercilessly, and without any shelter, the survivors are exposed to its full force. Skin that was already damaged by saltwater exposure begins to burn. Lips crack and bleed. Eyes become inflamed from the glare off the water. The food and water situation has become critical. The ship's biscuit is almost gone. What remains is a soggy, salty paste barely recognizable as food. The water barrels are more than half empty, and strict rationing is obviously necessary. But enforcing rationing becomes another source of conflict. Who decides who gets how much? Who monitors the distribution to ensure fairness? Corriard and Savigny try to establish a system, but their authority is tenuous at best. They're only able to maintain order because the alternative, another night of violence, is too terrible to contemplate. For now. Some people have stopped eating entirely. The combination of fear, nausea, and despair has killed their appetite. Others can't stop themselves from drinking seawater, despite knowing it will only make their thirst worse. The human body cannot process seawater. It's too salty, and attempting to metabolize it actually dehydrates you faster. But when you're desperately thirsty, watching waves break across the raft, the temptation to drink is almost irresistible. Those who give in to temptation suffer predictably. They experience severe diarrhea, accelerated dehydration, and hallucinations. Several men who drink seawater on the third day don't survive to see the fourth. By nightfall on July 7th, the count is down to 61 people. The third night passes without major violence, but only because everyone is too weak to fight. The raft has sorted itself into loose groups, the officers and educated men like Corriard and Savigny in one area, the soldiers in another, the most desperate and dying toward the edges. People have started to recognize that the raft has different zones of relative safety and danger. The fourth day, July 8th, dawns on a scene of utter misery. The raft is now sitting noticeably lower in the water than it was on day one. This is partly because the structure continues to deteriorate. More planks have worked loose, more lashings have failed. But it's also because of a factor no one wants to acknowledge: the bodies. The dead who weren't thrown overboard during the violence are still on the raft. In the chaos of survival, in the exhaustion and trauma, nobody has had the energy or will to dispose of them properly. Now, after days in the sun and salt water, those bodies are swelling, decomposing, creating both a health hazard and a nauseating addition to the already overwhelming stench of sweat, blood, and human waste. Eventually, someone has to address it. A group of survivors drag the dead bodies to the edge of the raft and push them into the ocean. It's grim work, made worse by the fact that some of these people were friends just days ago. As the bodies are removed, someone makes an observation that will lead to the most controversial aspect of the Medusa story. The observation is simple. The bodies are meat, protein, calories, sustenance. Day 4, mid-afternoon, somewhere on the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Africa, the raft of the Medusa drifts with no direction, no hope, and 61 people who are beginning to understand that they face a choice between death and something worse than death. The suggestion doesn't come from a single person. It emerges gradually, whispered at first, then spoken aloud, then discussed openly. The dead bodies in the water, couldn't they be used? The ship's biscuit is gone. The water is nearly depleted. They're literally starving. Wouldn't it make sense? The very idea should be unthinkable. Cannibalism represents perhaps the ultimate taboo in most human societies, the absolute boundary of acceptable behavior. It's the thing that separates humans from beasts, civilization from savagery, us from them. And yet, here, on this raft, the unthinkable begins to seem not just possible, but necessary. The surgeon Savigny, a man of medicine, of science, of Enlightenment values, later writes extensively about this moment. In his account, he describes the debate among the survivors. Some argue that eating the dead is wrong under any circumstances, a violation of human dignity that they cannot commit no matter the cost. Others point out that the dead are beyond caring, that survival of the living must take precedence, that European explorers have survived in desperate circumstances through similar means before. The debate isn't really about whether they'll do it, it's about when and how they'll admit they're going to do it. Here's what the survivors later confirm. On the fourth day, July 8, 1816, the first human flesh was consumed aboard the raft of the Medusa. The initial attempts are tentative, almost experimental. Small pieces of muscle tissue, cut from bodies that haven't been in the water long enough to decompose significantly. The meat is raw, They have no way to cook it, no fire, no dry wood. Raw human flesh, preserved somewhat by seawater, consumed by desperate men who have crossed a line they can never uncross. Some people refuse absolutely. They'd rather die than commit this act. And many do die, clinging to their principles as their bodies shut down from starvation. But others, perhaps a majority, make the calculation that survival is worth more than moral purity. They eat. The psychological impact is immediate and devastating. Many who eat become violently ill, their bodies rejecting the food or their minds rejecting the act. Vomiting is common. So is a kind of disassociative state, people staring blankly at the horizon, unable to reconcile what they've done with who they thought they were. But here's the terrible truth. It works. The protein provides calories. The calories provide energy. The people who eat, who cross that final taboo, stand a better chance of survival than those who don't. Over the next several days, the pattern becomes established. When someone dies, and people are dying regularly now from dehydration, exposure, infected wounds, or simply giving up, their body becomes sustenance for the living. The process becomes almost routine, stripped of the horror that initially accompanied it. Survivor accounts describe a system emerging. Certain people are designated to cut the meat, others to distribute it, others to dispose of what can't be used. It's organized cannibalism, rationalized by necessity, carried out by people who were, just a week earlier, respectable members of French society. The fourth night brings more violence, though of a different character than the second night's chaos. This time, it's more calculated. People are attacked not randomly, but specifically. The weakest, the ones who are dying anyway, the ones who won't be missed. There's a horrible logic to it. Why wait for someone to die naturally when you need food now? Better to hasten the inevitable. The line between murder and mercy killing becomes impossibly blurred. Is it murder to kill someone who's clearly dying and suffering? Is it mercy to end their pain while also providing sustenance for others? These are philosophical questions that should be debated in university classrooms, not acted out in blood on a wooden raft in the middle of the ocean. Correard and Savigny later insist that they tried to prevent outright murder, that they drew a line between using bodies of those who died naturally and actively killing people for food. But their accounts also acknowledge that this line became increasingly difficult to maintain as conditions deteriorated. By the morning of July 9th, the fifth day, the raft holds approximately 42 people. The rate of death is accelerating, and the survivors are sorting themselves into categories, those who will do whatever it takes to survive, and those who are waiting to die. The fifth day brings a new horror. The water runs out completely. The barrels are empty, dry, containing only a brown residue that might once have been drinking water. Without water, the human body begins to shut down rapidly. In the heat and sun of the African coast, dehydration is agonizingly fast. People's tongues swell, their urine becomes dark and thick, then stops entirely. Hallucinations begin, visions of rivers and fountains, mirages of ships coming to rescue them, conversations with dead friends and family. Some survivors try to collect morning dew on pieces of cloth, squeezing out a few drops of fresh water. Others try to rig crude rain catchers, hoping for a sudden storm. A few try drinking urine, their own or others. The human body is approximately 60% water, and when that water's gone, death follows within days. The sixth day, July 10th, sees the population drop to 30 people. The seventh day, July 11th, reduces it to 27. The raft itself is barely recognizable as a structure. The original 65 by 23-foot platform has essentially broken apart. What remains is a central core of perhaps 40 by 15 feet, surrounded by loose timbers that drift alongside. The lashings have rotted and loosened. Entire sections have detached and floated away. The survivors have consolidated onto the most stable section, abandoning the edges to the ocean. But this means they're more crowded than ever, standing in water that's now waist-deep across what remains of the platform. On the 8th day, July 12th, something happens that suggests the remaining survivors have passed beyond horror into something almost like transcendence. They stop fighting. The violence, the paranoia, the desperate scrambling for resources, it all just stops. Perhaps it's the sheer exhaustion. Perhaps it's the realization that fighting is pointless when everyone is dying anyway. Perhaps it's a kind of collective acceptance of fate. The remaining 27 people, many of them barely conscious, many hallucinating, all of them in the final stages of dehydration and starvation, simply exist. They stand or sit or lie across the timbers. They watch the horizon. They wait. By the 9th day, July 13th, the count is down to 15 people. But then, on the 10th day, something changes. Someone notices that the current has shifted. The raft, which had been drifting generally north-northwest, begins moving more directly west, toward the African coast. For the first time since the abandonment, there's a faint possibility that they might drift to shore before everyone dies. This possibility, tiny, desperate, probably delusional, breathes a last gasp of hope into the survivors. The ones who can still move try to use pieces of wood as crude paddles, attempting to steer the raft toward land. It's futile. Human muscle power cannot meaningfully direct a multi-ton raft through ocean currents, but the attempt itself is important. It means they haven't given up entirely. The 10th night passes, then the 11th, then the 12th. On the morning of July 17th, the 13th day, 15 people remain alive on what's left of the raft of the Medusa. 15 out of the original 147, a survival rate of about 10%. These 15 are in unspeakable condition. Their skin is burned black by the sun, cracked and bleeding from saltwater exposure. Their bodies are skeletal. Most have lost 30 or 40 pounds. Their minds are fractured by trauma, hallucination, and the memory of things they've done and witnessed. Several of them are blind, their eyes destroyed by sun glare and infection. Most can no longer stand without support. All are within days, perhaps hours of death. And then, on the horizon, they see a sail. The phenomenon of survival cannibalism, the consumption of human flesh in extreme survival situations, has been documented throughout maritime history, but the Medusa case stands apart for its scale and thoroughness of documentation. Maritime historian Dr. Jonathan Lamb has cataloged over 40 documented cases of survival cannibalism at sea between 1700 and 1900. What makes the Medusa unique is not that cannibalism occurred, it was tragically not uncommon in extreme maritime disasters, but that it happened in a situation that many survivors believed could have been avoided entirely through competent leadership. The psychological trauma of not just surviving through cannibalism, but doing so in a disaster caused by human incompetence rather than natural catastrophe, creates a specific kind of horror. The famous English case of R.V. Dudley and Stevens in 1884, which established that necessity is not a defense for murder even in survival situations, was argued with explicit reference to the Medusa precedent, showing how this 1816 disaster continued to shape legal thinking 70 years later. July 17, 1816, approximately 9 a.m. The brig Argus, part of the original convoy from the Medusa, is conducting a routine patrol off the African coast. The ship's lookout spots something unusual on the horizon, a low shape in the water, moving sluggishly with the current. As the Argus draws closer, the lookout realizes with horror that the shape is moving unnaturally. There are things on it, living things, people. Captain Parnajon immediately orders the ship to close distance. As they approach the raft, the crew falls silent. What they're seeing doesn't make sense. The raft, or what's left of it, is approximately 20 feet by 15 feet, a fraction of its original size. On it, there are figures. The crew initially counts 15 people, though some are so motionless it's hard to tell if they're alive or dead. These figures don't look human. They look like some nightmarish hybrid of corpse and scarecrow, their skin blackened and hanging loose, their limbs skeletal. As the Argus pulls alongside, the men on the raft begin to react. Some try to stand, falling immediately. Others wave weakly. A few manage to croak out words, though their voices are so damaged by dehydration that the sounds are barely recognizable as human speech. The rescue is difficult. The men are too weak to climb rope ladders. The Argus crew has to lower men down to physically lift the survivors aboard. Each man who comes aboard is a fresh horror. Their condition is beyond anything the Argus crew has seen. When the last man is brought aboard, the count is established: 15 survivors. But even this number is misleading, because not all of them will survive the rescue. 5 men die within the first 24 hours aboard the Argus. Their bodies, pushed beyond all reasonable limits for 13 days, simply cannot recover even with food, water, and medical care. They die in bunks, in relative comfort, tended by doctors, finally safe. And it's not enough. The final survivor count from the Raft of the Medusa? 10 men out of the original 147. A survival rate of 6.8%. Captain Parnajan and his crew are deeply shaken by what they found. The survivors, in their delirium, speak of things that seem impossible. They talk about the boats abandoning them. They describe violence, madness, cannibalism. But as the survivors gradually recover enough to give coherent accounts, Parnajan realizes these aren't hallucinations. These men are describing real events, events so horrifying that they will shake French society to their foundations. The Argus reaches Senegal on July 19th, 2 days after the rescue. The survivors are transferred to the hospital at St. Louis. The doctors are astounded that anyone survived at all. Alexander Corriard is among the survivors. So is Jean-Baptiste Henri Sevigny. Despite their ordeal, these 2 men retain enough mental clarity to understand something crucial. They have to tell this story. Over the next few weeks, 2 more survivors die from complications. The final tally? 8 survivors from the Raft of the Medusa. Meanwhile, Captain de Chaumaret and the others who escaped in the lifeboats reached shore without major incident. The governor, the officers, the wealthy passengers, all survived. Initially, de Chaumaret tries to control the narrative. He writes reports emphasizing the unavoidable nature of the grounding, the unfortunate necessity of abandoning the raft. His version of events paints him as a competent captain who did his best in impossible circumstances. This version might have stood unchallenged if not for 2 factors. First, the physical condition of the raft survivors makes clear that something extraordinary happened. 8 men who look like concentration camp victims, who speak of horrors that defy belief. This isn't consistent with a routine maritime accident. Second, Corriard and Sevigny begin writing. They're not going to let this be buried. They start documenting everything, preparing a report that will expose the truth. When the lifeboats departed on July 5, 1816, 17 men chose to stay on the Medusa rather than risk the boats or the raft. Some were too injured to evacuate. Others simply calculated that their odds were better staying with the ship. These 17 men set up a castaway camp on the wreck. They have access to the ship's remaining supplies: food stores, fresh water, wine, spirits, tools, and shelter. Compared to the hellish conditions on the raft, they're living in relative luxury. For 3 days, they wait, expecting rescue ships. But rescue doesn't come. 3 days stretch to 5, then 7, then 10. The men on the Medusa begin to realize they're in their own kind of nightmare. Yes, they have food and water, but they're trapped on a dying ship miles from shore with no way to reach land. The ship settles deeper into the sand, listing to one side as the hull structure fails. Seawater advances through the lower decks. The constant pounding of waves break apart the upper works. On July 17th, the same day the raft survivors are rescued, the Argus finally approaches the wreck. Captain Parnajan, fresh from the traumatic experience of rescuing the raft survivors, expects another scene of horror. Instead, he finds the 17 men alive, relatively healthy, and deeply relieved. They've survived for 2 weeks on the wreck in comparative comfort. This contrast will become important later. The same disaster that killed 139 people on the raft allowed 17 others to survive comfortably by simply staying put. It's a detail that emphasizes how the tragedy was not inevitable, but rather the result of specific, catastrophically bad decisions. The men are evacuated from the wreck. Before leaving, they attempt to salvage what they can, but most of the ship's contents are either unreachable or too heavy to move. The Medusa is left on the Arguin bank, a ghost ship, a monument to incompetence. Several weeks later, another French vessel approaches the Medusa. There are rumors of gold on board, coin destined for the colonial treasury. A salvage operation is mounted. Divers descend into the wreck. The conditions are nightmarish. The lower decks are a maze of collapsed beams, floating debris, and corpses. The divers find the strongbox and haul it up. The gold is recovered, sources suggest around 90,000 francs. The Medusa is left to rot. Over the following months and years, she gradually breaks apart. By 2020, just 4 years after the grounding, the Medusa is completely gone. The physical ship has vanished, dissolved into the Atlantic. But the memory refuses to die. August 1816. The survivors of the Medusa disaster arrive back in France. The 8 survivors from the raft are in the worst condition, emaciated, traumatized, bearing scars that will never heal. The French government and Navy attempt to manage the situation quietly. An internal investigation is launched. Captain de Chaumaret is relieved of command. The official line is that this was a tragic but routine maritime accident. This strategy of quiet suppression might have worked in an earlier era, but 1816 is a time of political upheaval, of a society still processing the trauma of revolution and empire. And into this volatile mix comes a story so explosive that suppression becomes impossible. The spark is lit by Couriard and Savigny. These 2 men have spent their recovery period writing obsessively, documenting everything that happened on the raft, every detail, every decision, every horror. And crucially, they've been identifying who is responsible. By November 1816, they've completed their account. Naufrage de la frégate La Méduse, the shipwreck of the frigate Medusa. It's perhaps 20,000 words, but those words are dynamite. The document doesn't just describe what happened, it names names, assigns blame, and contextualizes the disaster within France's political situation. Couriard and Savigny make explicit what many already suspected, that de Chaumaret was appointed not for competence, but for political loyalty, that the entire disaster stemmed from the Bourbon regime prioritizing aristocratic bloodlines over merit, that the abandonment of the raft represented the aristocracy literally cutting loose the common people to save themselves. The metaphor is so perfect it almost seems contrived, but it's not. It really happened. Aristocrats really did secure the lifeboats. Common soldiers really were consigned to the raft. The boats really did cut the tow lines, and the people on the raft really did descend into a Hobbesian nightmare while the elite sailed safely to shore. Initially, Couriard and Savigny struggle to find a publisher. The account is too controversial, too politically explosive. The manuscript circulates in Paris, building a reputation as a forbidden document. Then, in January 1817, an abbreviated version is published in the Journal des Débats. The response is instantaneous and overwhelming. The story spreads through Paris like wildfire. Within weeks, everyone in French society is talking about the Medusa. The full book-length account is published shortly thereafter and becomes a bestseller despite government attempts to suppress it. Multiple editions are published. Translations appear in English, German, Spanish, Italian. The story jumps national boundaries, becoming an international scandal. Why does this particular story resonate so powerfully? France in 1816-1817 is a society still traumatized by the Revolution and Napoleonic era. There's deep unresolved tension between revolutionary ideals of merit and equality and the restored monarchy's insistence on traditional hierarchy. The Medusa becomes a perfect encapsulation of that tension. Political opposition groups seize on the Medusa as a rallying point. Liberal newspapers run extended coverage. Political cartoons appear showing de Chaumareix as a grinning skeleton. The government's attempts to suppress the narrative only make things worse. The Navy attempts damage control. They expedite the court-martial of de Chaumareix. The trial begins in February 1817. De Chaumareix is found guilty of abandonment of his ship and lack of ability in his command. The sentence: 3 years in prison and permanent dismissal from the Navy. Many of the other officers involved, the ones who cut the tow lines, are either not prosecuted or receive minor administrative punishments. This outcome enrages the public. The message seems clear: incompetence merits punishment, but the actual deaths, the abandonment, that's just unfortunate reality, not a crime. But while the legal system produces an unsatisfying conclusion, the cultural response is just beginning. Because in Paris, a young artist named Théodore Géricault has been following the story with obsessive interest. Théodore Géricault is 27 years old in 1817 when he first hears the story of the Medusa. He's already an accomplished artist, but he's searching for a subject that will allow him to create something truly significant. When he encounters the Medusa narrative, he becomes obsessed. This is what he's been searching for, a story of human endurance and failure, of hope and despair, of civilization collapsing under pressure. Géricault doesn't just paint from imagination, he conducts research with a thoroughness that would impress a modern journalist. He tracks down survivors and interviews them at length. He talks to Corriard and Savigny multiple times, taking detailed notes. He visits morgues and hospitals to study dead and dying bodies, sketching corpses to understand how emaciation and dehydration affect human anatomy. His studio becomes a disturbing place. He reportedly keeps severed limbs on hand as reference material. He even constructs a scale model of the raft in his studio, using it to work out the geometry of his composition. The painting he creates over the next year and a half is monumental in every sense. The canvas measures 16 feet by 23 feet, large enough that the figures depicted are essentially life-sized. The composition is brilliant and controversial. He doesn't show the worst moments, the violence, the cannibalism. Instead, he captures a single moment, the survivors spotting the ship that will eventually rescue them, but that's still too far away to be certain of salvation. It's the moment of maximum dramatic tension. There's a ship on the horizon. Some survivors are waving desperately. Others are too weak or despairing to believe rescue is possible. Bodies litter the foreground. The composition builds from death and despair in the foreground up to hope in the background, a pyramid of human suffering pointing toward a tiny sail that might or might not mean salvation. When Le Radeau de la Méduse, the raft of the Medusa, is exhibited at the Paris Salon in 1819, it causes an immediate sensation. Viewers are shocked by the scale and brutality. This isn't a romanticized maritime scene. The bodies are realistic. You can see the emaciation, the wounds, the physical degradation. The scene is dark, murky, with a stormy quality that emphasizes the desperation. Critics are divided. Conservatives attack it as morbid, depressing, politically motivated. Liberals praise it as truth-telling, as art that refuses to look away from uncomfortable reality. The public response is overwhelming. The painting draws enormous crowds. Over 50,000 people view it in its first year, a massive number for the era. People stand in front of it for extended periods, arguing about what it means. The painting does something crucial. It makes the Medusa disaster impossible to forget. It fixes the image in cultural memory, that pyramid of suffering, that desperate reaching toward the distant sail, that accumulation of bodies representing 139 deaths. Géricault's work also establishes a new aesthetic, the depiction of contemporary catastrophe with unflinching realism. This isn't traditional history painting. This is modern tragedy, painted with documentary precision, refusing to make suffering beautiful or noble. The painting travels to London, where it draws similar crowds and controversy. It influences a generation of artists who see in Jericho's work a new possibility for what art can be and do. Jericho himself doesn't live to see the full impact of his work. He dies in 1824 at just 32 years old from injuries sustained in a riding accident. But his painting lives on, eventually finding a permanent home in the Louvre. Today, the Raft of the Medusa is recognized as one of the pivotal works of Romanticism and a masterpiece of French painting. But it's more than that. It's a witness statement, a document of atrocity, a refusal to let suffering be forgotten. To understand the broader significance of the Medusa disaster, we must place it within the context of maritime risk in the early 19th century. According to Lloyd's of London records, between 1815 and 1820, approximately 3,200 ships were lost globally, an average of 640 per year, representing roughly 2.7% of the world's merchant and naval fleet. In this environment of routine maritime catastrophe, the Medusa might have been just another statistic. What transformed it into a cultural touchstone was the convergence of several factors: clear human responsibility rather than natural causes, dramatic class division in survival rates, survival of educated witnesses who could document the horror, and the political timing in post-Napoleonic France. The Medusa crystallized Enlightenment and revolutionary anxieties about the relationship between authority and competence, between social class and moral worth, between civilization and savagery, making it not just a maritime disaster, but a philosophical crisis. What happens to the 8 men who survived the raft? How does someone return to normal life after experiencing what they experienced? The answer, in most cases, is they don't. Alexandre Corillard is perhaps the most functional of the survivors in the immediate aftermath. He channels his trauma into documentation and advocacy, spending years fighting for proper compensation and recognition. He publishes multiple editions of the narrative, each expanded with new details. But the work takes its toll. Corillard suffers from what we would now recognize as severe PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, periods of depression and rage. He dies in 1857 at age 69, having spent 41 years living with the memories of those 13 days. In his later writings, he describes the disaster as something he experiences not in the past, but continuously. Jean-Baptiste Henri Savigny follows a similar path. He co-authors the account with Corillard and spends years advocating for recognition. But Savigny struggles even more visibly with the psychological aftermath. He suffers from what contemporary accounts describe as nervous disorders, probably a combination of PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Savigny dies in 1843 at age 56. His later life is marked by controversy. He was accused at various points of exaggerating details, though modern historians generally validate his core account. The other 6 survivors largely disappear from the historical record. They didn't write books, they didn't give extensive interviews, they tried to return to anonymity. But we catch glimpses of them in various documents. One survivor was institutionalized for mental illness within a year of the rescue. Another died by suicide in 1822. A third became a recluse, refusing to speak about the raft even to family. The survivors from the lifeboats, the officers and passengers who abandoned the raft, faced a different kind of hell: guilt and social condemnation. Many lost their positions or reputations. Some faced public harassment. Governor Schmaltz saw his career effectively end. He spent decades trying to rehabilitate his reputation, publishing his own account that attempted to justify his actions. It didn't work. Captain de Chaumaret served his 3-year prison sentence and was released in 1820. He lived until 1841, dying at age 80. His later life is sparsely documented. He seems to have withdrawn from public view. There are reports that he became intensely religious, possibly seeking redemption. Whether he found any peace is unknown. The contrast between the survivors' experiences and the public's fascination is striking. While the survivors suffered, the story thrived. The Medusa became entertainment, a moral lesson, a political football. But for the men who lived through it, the story was a wound that never healed. Modern trauma psychology recognizes what the survivors experienced: complex PTSD from prolonged trauma, with elements of survivor's guilt, moral injury, and the specific trauma of survival cannibalism. In the 19th century, with no real understanding of PTSD and no effective treatments, the survivors were essentially on their own. Some aspects border on the paranormal, though with grounded explanations. Multiple survivors reported shared hallucinations, seeing the same phantom ships, the same ghostly figures. Modern psychology understands this as a phenomenon that can occur with group trauma. When multiple people experience similar physical conditions, their brains can generate similar hallucinations, which then reinforce each other through social interaction. Survivors also reported persistent sensations years after: the feeling of the raft rocking, phantom sensations of cold seawater, even olfactory hallucinations of decomposition. These are consistent with trauma-related sensory memories. But the most haunting aspect isn't the paranormal speculation. It's the mundane horror of living with memories that cannot be integrated into a normal life. How do you sit at a dinner table after you've eaten human flesh? How do you trust other people after you've seen civilization collapse in 3 days? How do you maintain faith in humanity after experiencing what happened on that raft? These questions don't have good answers. The survivors discovered that surviving the disaster was only the beginning. The real challenge was surviving the survival, living with what they'd seen, what they'd done, what they'd become. Let's look at the disaster through the cold lens of statistics, because the numbers themselves tell a story of almost mathematical horror. Lifeboats, 250 people. Raft, 147 people. Remained on wreck, 17 people. Total, approximately 414. Lifeboats, 245 out of 250 survived, equals 98% survival rate. Wreck, 17 out of 17 survived, equals 100% survival rate. Raft, 8 out of 147 survived, equals 5.4% survival rate. Think about that disparity. If you were assigned to a lifeboat, you had a 98% chance of surviving. If you stayed on the wreck, you were fine. If you were assigned to the raft, you had a 94.6% chance of dying. The survival rate on the raft was actually worse than many immediately catastrophic disasters. The sinking of the Titanic had a survival rate of about 32%, 6 times better than the Medusa raft. Timeline of death on the raft. Day 1, July 5th, 147 people. Day 2, July 6th, 145 people, 2 dead. Day 3, July 7th, 67 people, 78 dead from violence. Day 4, July 8th, 61 people, 6 dead. Day 5, July 9th, 42 people, 19 dead. Day 6th, July 10th, 30 people, 12 dead. Day 7, July 11th, 27 people, 3 dead. Day 8, July 12th, 20 people, 7 dead. Day 9, July 13th, 15 people, 5 dead. Days 10 through 13, 15 people, stable until rescue. The most lethal period was the 3rd night, when approximately 78 people died in less than 12 hours, a death rate of 53%. That's worse than the first day at the Battle of the Somme. Resource calculations. Starting supplies for 147 people. Water, approximately 120 liters total, equals 0.81 liters per person. Food, approximately 11 kilograms ship's biscuit, equals 75 grams per person. Wine, approximately 60 liters, equals 0.41 liters per person. The human body requires approximately 2 to 3 liters of water per day under normal conditions, 3 to 4 liters in hot conditions, 5+ liters when exercising in heat with sun exposure. The water supply would last approximately 6 hours per person under the conditions they faced.
The food would provide perhaps 300 calories per person. You need about 2,000 calories per day just to maintain basic function. They were dead from the moment the boats cast off. The only question was timing.
Survivors described losing approximately 30 to 40 pounds over 13 days. That's an average weight loss of 2.3 to 3.1 pounds per day. For comparison, healthy weight loss is 1 to 2 pounds per week. Starvation diets typically result in 2 to 3 pounds per week. Holocaust survivors lost approximately 0.5 to 1 pound per day. The Medusa survivors' weight loss was 3 to 4 times faster than concentration camp inmates. Analysis suggests that age was a significant factor. All 8 survivors were between 24 and 35 years old. No one over 40 survived. No one under 20 survived. This makes physiological sense. The ordeal required both physical strength and mental resilience. Of the 8 Raft survivors, 2 were officers or professionals, Coréard, Savigny. 6 were soldiers or crew. 0 were civilians or aristocrats. Meanwhile, of the 250 people in the lifeboats, nearly 100% of aristocrats survived. Nearly 100% of wealthy passengers survived. Nearly 100% of officers survived. The class division in survival rates is stark and undeniable. Your social status perfectly predicted your survival. Officers formally charged: 1. Deschaumeres. Officers who cut tow lines, at least 3, possibly 5. Officers who faced any punishment, 1. Length of Deschaumeres' sentence, 3 years. Estimated readers of Coréard and Savigny's account, over 100,000 in the first year. Editions published, at least 5 in French, plus translations in 6+ languages. Visitors to Géricault's painting, first year, approximately 50,000. Articles written 1816 to 1820, over 200 in French press alone. The Medusa account selling 100,000 copies in its first year is roughly equivalent to a modern blockbuster book selling 10 to 15 million copies. Of the 8 Raft survivors, 2 died within 6 months of rescue. 2 more died within 5 years. Only 4 lived to natural old age. Average life expectancy, 56 years. The mathematics of the Medusa tell a clear story. This was not an unavoidable tragedy. It was a systematic failure of leadership, ethics, and human solidarity, translated into statistics that reveal the horrifying efficiency of abandonment. Among the most disturbing elements of survivor testimony are the recurring reports of phantom ships, impossible visions, and shared hallucinations. Are these paranormal experiences or products of extreme stress? On at least 4 occasions, multiple survivors reported seeing ships on the horizon. In each case, they were certain they saw sails, sometimes even making out details. They would scream, wave, attempt to signal. Then the ships would fade away or transform into clouds. On day 6, at least a dozen survivors swore they saw a ship approaching directly. They could see it clearly for over an hour. Some claimed to see sailors on deck. Then, as the sun shifted, they realized they were looking at a cloud formation. On day 9, survivors reported seeing a massive ship approaching at night. They claimed to see lights, to hear voices. Morning came, and there was nothing. Modern neuroscience offers compelling explanations. First, consider the physical conditions: severe dehydration, starvation, sleep depriving, sun exposure, and trauma. Each individually can cause hallucinations. Combined, they create a perfect storm for perceptual distortion. Dehydration specifically causes reduced blood flow to the brain, causing hypoxia. Electrolyte imbalances disrupting neural signaling. Reduced tear production leading to visual distortions. Increased blood thickness reducing oxygen delivery. The visual cortex starts malfunctioning, seeing patterns where none exist, filling gaps with expected information rather than actual sensory input. Second, there's expectant attention. When you desperately want to see something, your brain becomes hyperactive in searching for it. The visual system is predictive, not just reactive. Under normal conditions, sensory input corrects those guesses. But when sensory input is degraded, the guesses can dominate. Third, there's social contagion. When one person claims to see something, others become primed to see it too. This isn't dishonesty, it's a normal feature of human perception. Under extreme stress, this tendency becomes overwhelming.
Multiple times, survivors swore they could see land, the African coast clearly visible. They would spend hours watching it, convinced they were drifting toward shore. Then the land would resolve into clouds or vanish. This is actually a well-documented maritime phenomenon called fataga morgana, a complex form of superior mirage caused by temperature inversions. Layers of air at different temperatures can act like lenses, bending light and creating images of objects beyond the horizon or that don't exist. Experienced sailors knew about fataga morgana, but the survivors, desperate for hope, weren't in a position to make careful distinctions. Perhaps the most disturbing reports are of specific, detailed visions that multiple people experienced simultaneously. On day 7, at least 6 survivors reported seeing a large mansion on the water, complete with balconies, windows, and people waving. They could see it clearly for several minutes, then it dissolved. Group hallucinations under extreme conditions are well documented. The mechanism is, one person has a hallucination and describes it. Others, primed by the description, begin to see the same thing. The shared experience reinforces each person's perception. The brain, desperate for confirmation, accepts the shared vision as real. Memory consolidates this as genuine experience. Several survivors reported religious experiences. They saw angels, heard divine voices, experienced moments of transcendent clarity. Savigny wrote extensively about a vision on day 10 in which he heard a voice telling him he would survive. He interpreted this as divine intervention. From a modern perspective, this is consistent with temporal lobe activity during extreme stress. The temporal lobes, particularly when deprived of oxygen and flooded with stress hormones, can generate experiences of profound meaning, divine presence, or transcendent revelation. This doesn't invalidate the experiences. Whether they're really divine intervention or just neuroscience is largely interpretation. What matters is that these experiences gave some survivors a reason to continue living. Can we definitively rule out paranormal explanations? No, science cannot prove a negative. But we don't need paranormal explanations. Everything the survivors experienced is consistent with well-understood psychological and neurological phenomena. The human brain under extreme stress is capable of generating incredibly vivid, convincing experiences that have no basis in external reality. That these visions were shared makes them no less the product of human neurology. It just reminds us that we're social animals, that our realities are shaped by collective experience, and that, under extreme conditions, the line between individual and shared consciousness becomes permeable. The ghosts on the Medusa were real. They were just ghosts the survivors created themselves, products of dying brains desperate to find hope in an empty ocean. The Raft of the Medusa didn't just kill 139 people, it changed how we think about leadership, survival ethics, social responsibility, and the nature of civilization itself. The French Navy, humiliated by the disaster, instituted sweeping reforms. Appointments to naval commands restructured to prioritize experience over political loyalty. New protocols for emergency evacuation established. Navigation procedures for the African coast codified. Formal inquiry system established for investigating disasters. These reforms spread internationally. By the 1820s, most major naval powers had adopted protocols influenced by the Medusa. The disaster contributed to the development of international maritime law. The concept of duty to rescue, that ships are obligated to assist vessels in distress, was strengthened partly in response to the Medusa.
The Medusa raised profound questions about survival ethics still debated today. Is cannibalism justified for survival? Under what circumstances can you kill one person to save others? What obligations do the strong have to the weak when resources are scarce? The famous case of R.V. Dudley and Stevens, 1884, in England, where two sailors were prosecuted for killing and eating a cabin boy, was argued with explicit reference to the Medusa. The defense tried to establish a legal principle of necessity based on the Medusa precedent. The court ruled that necessity is not a defense for murder, establishing a principle that remains controversial. Philosophy departments have used the Medusa as a case study for decades. It's a perfect test case for consequentialist versus deontological ethics. In France, the Medusa became a permanent fixture of political discourse. It was invoked whenever critics wanted to attack the restored monarchy, whenever reformers argued for meritocracy over aristocracy. The disaster contributed to the erosion of the Bourbon Restoration's legitimacy. When the July Revolution of 1830 finally overthrew the Bourbons, the Medusa was explicitly referenced in revolutionary speeches. The metaphor of cutting the tow ropes, abandoning those dependent on you, entered political vocabulary across Europe. Beyond Géricault's painting, the Medusa inspired countless works. Victor Hugo referenced it in multiple works. Michel Séville analyzed it extensively. Edgar Allan Poe knew the story and arguably drew on it for The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. Herman Melville almost certainly knew it when writing Moby Dick. The disaster became a template for maritime horror stories. When authors wanted to explore human nature under extreme conditions, they often drew on the Medusa narrative. The Medusa contributed to multiple scientific fields. Detailed documentation of starvation's effects provided valuable data. Savigny's medical descriptions were studied by physiologists. One of the earliest well-documented cases of what we now call PTSD. Carreyard and Savigny's descriptions of ongoing trauma provided early documentation of psychological injury. The cannibalism contributed to debates about human universals versus cultural constructs. Is the taboo absolute or situational? The Medusa suggested it's situational. Became a case study in group dynamics, social hierarchy, and collective behavior under stress. Why does the Medusa still matter today, over 200 years later? First, because the core questions remain relevant. We still face situations where leaders fail, where resources are insufficient, where difficult choices must be made. Medical triage, climate refugees, resource allocation during pandemics, these are all Medusa scenarios in different forms. The COVID-19 pandemic brought Medusa-like dilemmas into sharp focus. Who gets ventilators when there aren't enough? Who gets vaccine priority? The ethical frameworks we use were partly shaped by cases like the Medusa. Second, the disaster speaks to something deep about human nature. We like to think civilization is stable. The Medusa reminds us that it can collapse in 3 days, that humans can transform from neighbors to cannibals in less than a week. Third, the class dynamics remain relevant. The fact that social position predicted survival isn't just historical trivia, it's a pattern that repeats. When the Titanic sank, first-class passengers survived at far higher rates than third class. When Hurricane Katrina hit, the wealthy evacuated while the poor drowned. The Medusa's lesson that when resources are scarce, power determines who lives is as true now as it was in 1816. Despite 2 centuries of analysis, some questions remain unresolved. Did the officers plan to abandon the raft from the beginning? Some historians argue the entire evacuation was designed to sacrifice the raft passengers. Others maintain it was incompetence rather than malice. We'll probably never know for certain. Exactly what happened? All survivors agreed human flesh was consumed, but accounts differ on details. Was it only the already dead, or were people killed for food? Testimonies conflict. Who initiated the violence on the second night? Some accounts describe it as a mutiny. Others suggest it was more complex, a breakdown everyone participated in. These unresolved questions don't diminish the disaster's significance. They remind us that real historical events are messy, that truth is elusive. There's no grand memorial to the victims, no monument at sea, no plaque. The wreck itself dissolved into the Atlantic. The only memorial is Géricault's painting, hanging in the Louvre. Millions walk past it each year. Most stop, drawn by its size and emotional power. Some know the story, many don't. But the painting does its work regardless. It forces viewers to confront suffering, to ask questions about what humans are capable of. The painting is a perfect memorial. It doesn't glorify or redeem. It just presents, unflinching and undeniable, and asks us to look, to really look, to see what humans can become when civilization fails. And we keep looking, generation after generation, because the Medusa remains relevant. As long as humans face scarcity, as long as leaders can fail, as long as the question of who lives and who dies must be answered, the raft of the Medusa will continue to haunt us. We've spent considerable time exploring the Medusa disaster. Now we need to confront the central question. What does this teach us about humanity, about civilization, about ourselves? The most fundamental lesson is how quickly civilization can collapse. The people who boarded the Medusa were products of European civilization, educated, cultured, bound by social contracts and moral codes developed over centuries. Within 3 days, they were killing each other. Within a week, they were committing cannibalism. Within 2 weeks, they had experienced horrors that would haunt them for life. 3 days. That's how long it took for the veneer of civilization to crack and fall away. This isn't because the people were unusually savage. It's because civilization is not an intrinsic property of humans. It's a structure we build and maintain through constant effort. Remove the conditions that support that structure, and it collapses with shocking speed. The implication is troubling. We're all a few days of deprivation away from savagery. The moral frameworks we take for granted, the ethical principles we consider absolute, all depend on circumstances remaining within tolerable ranges. The Medusa is a case study in leadership failure. Deschamps' incompetence didn't just cause a shipwreck, it created conditions that led to 139 deaths through a cascade of bad decisions. The grounding was preventable, the evacuation was botched, the abandonment was unforgivable. And throughout, Deschamps' authority stemmed not from competence, but from political connections. He was captain because he was loyal to the monarchy, not because he could captain a ship. This pattern repeats throughout history. Leaders selected for loyalty, ideology, or social connections rather than competence, organizations that prioritize hierarchy over effectiveness, systems that value maintaining authority over achieving results.
Is survival sufficient justification for any action? The Medusa forces us to grapple with this in its rawest form. The survivors who ate human flesh crossed a profound taboo, but they survived, and those who refused mostly died. From a purely consequentialist standpoint, eating the dead was the correct choice. But this ignores the psychological and moral cost. The survivors were haunted for life. They survived physically, but at enormous psychological cost. There's no universal answer. Some survivors thought yes, life even at that price. Others chose no, death with moral codes intact. Both choices deserve respect. What the Medusa shows is that survival ethics are not abstract philosophical problems. They're real decisions with no clean resolutions. You can survive and be destroyed by what you did. You can die and preserve your humanity. Neither choice is obviously correct. One striking aspect is how social hierarchies persisted even as everything else collapsed. The officers secured the lifeboats, the wealthy got priority, the common soldiers were assigned to the raft. This wasn't random, it was deliberate application of existing social structure to crisis.
And it resulted in nearly perfect correlation between social class and survival. This tells us something uncomfortable about how deeply social hierarchies are embedded in human psychology. We don't just tolerate inequality, we naturalize it. Even in life or death crisis, it doesn't occur to most people to question whether existing hierarchy should determine who lives and who dies. And on the Raft, new hierarchies emerged almost immediately. Educated men assumed leadership, soldiers formed factions, the sick were pushed to the edges. This isn't necessarily bad, some organization is better than none, but it shows how automatically humans default to hierarchy. Why do humans create these visions of rescue ships and divine intervention? What function do they serve? The answer? They provide hope. When objective reality offers none, the brain generates its own. It creates visions of rescue, of land, of divine voices. These visions are adaptive in the short term, they keep people fighting to survive. But they're maladaptive in the medium term. People waste energy signaling to ships that aren't there. The fact that these visions are shared suggests something about human psychology. We're wired to coordinate our realities. If someone we trust says they see something, our brains adjust to see it too. This helps explain how groups maintain demonstrably false beliefs, how collective delusions form, how entire societies can become convinced of things that aren't true. What would you do? It's easy to imagine yourself as the hero, the person who shares fairly, who refuses to abandon others, who maintains moral clarity. But statistically, most of us would be the people who died. We'd be the ones who drank seawater, who got pushed off during violence, who gave up. Or we'd be the ones who did terrible things. The Medusa strips away comfortable illusions about human nature. It shows us what we're capable of, both the heroism and the horror. And it forces us to acknowledge that we don't really know which version would emerge under such conditions. Maybe you'd be brave. Maybe you'd maintain ethics. Maybe you'd help others even at cost to yourself. But maybe not. Maybe you'd discover that survival instincts override moral frameworks. Maybe you'd find that when faced with death, principles become negotiable. The Medusa doesn't let us off the hook with easy answers. It shows us that under extreme conditions, almost anyone is capable of almost anything. That the boundaries we imagine between civilization and savagery are far more permeable than we want to believe. But making those choices requires remembering. It requires looking at uncomfortable truths, at disturbing histories, at the dark potential within human nature. It requires acknowledging that we're all potential Medusa survivors, that under the right conditions, we might abandon others. We might commit unthinkable acts. We might become something we currently can't imagine. The Raft of the Medusa floats through history as a ghost ship, a nightmare vision of human failure and suffering. 147 people climbed onto that platform on July 5, 1816. Only 8 survived 13 days later. Those 8 carried scars for the rest of their lives. The 139 who died experienced horrors that remain almost incomprehensible. Their story doesn't offer comfort. It doesn't provide easy answers or redeeming conclusions. It doesn't tell us that humanity is fundamentally good or that justice prevails or that suffering has meaning. What it offers instead is truth. The truth about what happens when leadership fails, when resources vanish, when social structures collapse, when civilization's thin veneer cracks and falls away. The truth about what humans are capable of, both the heroism and the horror. The truth about how quickly we can transform from neighbors into enemies, from civilized beings into desperate animals. That truth is uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Because only by understanding what happened on the raft, really understanding it, not sanitizing it, can we hope to prevent similar disasters. The Medusa calls to us across 2 centuries, not with answers, but with questions. What would you do? What should you do? How do you maintain humanity when everything that supports it disappears? How do you make impossible choices? How do you live with what survival requires?
These questions have no simple answers, but they're worth asking, worth confronting, worth carrying with us. Because somewhere, right now, someone is facing Medusa-like conditions. Someone is on their own raft, making impossible choices, discovering what they're capable of. The story of the Medusa can't prevent those situations entirely, but it can prepare us, warn us, remind us of what's at stake when we tolerate incompetent leadership, when we ignore warning signs, when we prioritize power over justice. 147 people boarded a raft on July 5, 1816. Only 8 survived to tell the tale. But their story survived too, carried forward by testimony and art and the stubborn human refusal to let horror be forgotten. That's the final lesson. Bearing witness matters. Documentation matters. Truth-telling matters. Even when the truth is uncomfortable, even when it challenges our assumptions, even when it reveals things about human nature we'd rather not acknowledge, especially then, the truth matters. The raft of the Medusa floats on, through history, through art, through collective memory. It floats on as a warning, a challenge, and a mirror reflecting back our own faces, showing us not who we are, but who we might become if we ever find ourselves adrift, with resources vanishing and hope fading and the dark ocean waiting below. May we never need to discover which version of ourselves that raft would reveal. May we build systems strong enough that such rafts are never necessary, and may we never forget the 139 people who died there, or the 8 who survived, or the lessons written in their suffering. The Medusa calls across the centuries. Are we listening?